All right, welcome to American Spirits episode 12, where we are returning to Professor Merrill Jensen's work. Today we're looking at a book called The New Nation, A History of the United States During the Confederation, 1781 to 1789. But actually, the title's even longer. Subtitle: The Definitive Account of the First Years of the United States. So, today it's just Ryan and myself. Mr. Quinn, unfortunately, is not able to join us today, but I think we will make do. How are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. It might be the last really warm day of the year for me, so is that going to be a good or bad thing? I guess I'll find out, because I'm not sure which way I want it to go at this point. Anyway, the new nation. So, this is a deeper history of the United States during the Confederation, written by Jensen. Now, his previous book was published in 1940. This one was published in 1950 and is basically just a follow up with a lot more detail, and it's more of a broader history rather than the type of argumentative book I found previously, where his previous book was arguing really that the Articles of the Confederation were sort of the true spirit of American democracy, and the Constitution was this radical, not radical, but conservative, reactionary coup, basically, which might not even be a new take to people. But he, unlike some others, Jensen that is, argues that this is a good thing. Now, of course, this book is quite littered with his opinions as well. It's not an unbiased history, but that's fine. I tend to prefer histories to have a bit of a point to them and not just be, a sort of attempt at some objective telling of a story, because I just find arguing for a position is a lot more interesting than just trying to pretend you're entirely neutral, which we know no one is. So we're only going to do half or maybe even a third of the book today. We'll see where we go. There's a lot of different topics covered, but do you have any initial thoughts on the bits of the book we've read so far?
There's some interesting tie-ins with Spengler potentially, but unfortunately, that's towards like the end chapters of what we read this week, and going out of order is a little bit risky.
Yeah, let's definitely stay in order. So, with that in mind, why don't we just get into it? I do have a solid number of screenshots. Hopefully, we can get through everything today. This was a little difficult actually to select from, because there are so many different ideas presented in here. And of course, we haven't read the entire book yet. And I don't just want to do like a summary, but we'll see what happens. So let's bring up just the first one. What is that? Screenshot 29. So the first part of the book, actually, maybe the first like 40 to 50 pages, the time period is still toward the end of the revolution, because of course the articles are adopted before the fighting is complete. So the revolution is sort of winding down at this point. And let's see, on page 29 it says, quote, Congress had a tremendous problem. It had to fight a war without money and without the power of coercion over either the states or their citizens. Congress worked badly, haltingly, and inefficiently, but it did manage to run the war despite all the obstacles. Throughout the war, it supported Washington, although at times with hesitation and for good reason. Perhaps few generals in history have been so often defeated and still retained their commands. The continuous support of Washington by Congress did give the military policies of the Revolution a kind of coherence that made it possible to win through independence in the end. So I just thought that was interesting, because it sort of highlights. Well, one of the things Jensen tends to do is not idealize or lionize figures, and I just thought that was some interesting ground setting. Him sort of pointing out that Washington lost most of his battles and the difficulties which the often maligned Congress faced in the situation they were trying to run.
Something else that's important, and we may discuss this in other works on the period in the future, is that Washington implemented a very controversial strategy, internally controversial, of trying to like Europeanize the Continental Army. Because there were many people who thought that the Continental Army should function purely as like like a sort of harassment and guerrilla force. Washington and many other generals opted instead for like a more traditional, gentlemanly European force that was unpopular, to say the least. In fact, I believe it was the Continental, the Congress of the under the Confederation appointed a war board above him because a lot of the people didn't trust him. It's just that the board never did anything. So it's might be worth pointing out. I received a lot of like Washington mythology when I was growing up and in education. So I don't know how much of this is known to our audience, but it might just be worth stating things like that. That he was his methods were unpopular at the very least.
Indeed, and of course, another thing Jensen points out is that rather than a singular army, there were actually 14 armies. There were the 13 separate state militias, and then the Continental Army as well. So it was quite a difficult situation. Anyway, on page 41, this is sort of getting to the wrap up of the section on paper money. Now, I think most people know that there were paper money was issued during the Revolution, and there were sort of major problems with it. And eventually, it was replaced with a separate money that was valued at a different ratio, and the bills were collected and destroyed. Anyway, so this is a sort of point toward the end of that period. Quote, the result of such actions by men in positions of economic power was to complete the destruction of paper finance as a means of fighting the war. By March of 1781, when the Articles of Confederation went into effect, Congress was advising the states to do away with their legal tender laws. Shortly thereafter, it advised them to do away with paper money entirely. By the end of 1781, paper currency had stopped circulating as money. Some states were still collecting it as taxes and turning it over to Congress for destruction, and some speculators still toyed with it, but the financial and political importance of continental money was forever ended. So the reason I wanted to bring that up is because, the Articles of Confederation period is talked about as this disaster, and I thought this was important to note that at the point at which the Articles were actually adopted, paper money was already out of the picture. So there's no tie between whatever economic problems you want to blame on the Articles relating to paper money. That was a Revolutionary War period thing that had no tie to the Articles themselves.
Right, and this is very important because reading this book, it's very clear that Jensen is trying to refute perhaps older claims, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. That the Confederation was responsible for a ton of economic problems in the country at the time. Now, I find this interesting because I never really got the impression from any of my education or reading that the Articles of Confederation caused the economic problems, and I've read quite a breadth of different political opinions on the matter. I am wondering if this is an older line of rhetoric that Jensen is trying to refute here, trying to separate the Articles of Confederation from wartime economics and financing. Just because, once again, I never really came across this, and I'm wondering if he just won the narrative battle here.
That's a good question. It's been far too long for me to really remember what I was taught about the Articles, which is basically nothing. But he does spend quite a few pages in the beginning of the book, at least dozens of pages on paper money, finance, and everything related to the demobilization and currency. So, yeah, I wonder if this is an older narrative that sort of no longer exists that he's trying to deal with. But in any case, let's move on to page 43. And now we're going to get into something that's going to be a little more familiar in relation to where we left off with the last book. We were sort of talking about the conservative faction, as we put it, which is, as we would put it, the nationalist faction, who are trying to create a strong national government as opposed to a federal government that leaves power in the hands of the states. After the adoption of the Articles, the nationalists are still, of course, trying to get their way and trying to force the Confederation into their more nationalist model. So I will read a bit here about how that was attempted. Quote, for a time, the revolution swept many of the men who believed thus from positions of effectiveness, although enough remained in legislative seats to voice from time to time the demand for centralized authority. They could not change the Articles of Confederation now before the states for ratification, but they could and did seek to establish precedents upon the basis of which they could argue the sovereignty of Congress. Governor Morris had favored such strategy as early as 1775 when he heard that Congress might consider the case of James Rivington, the Tory printer in New York City. Morris declared that such action by Congress would give it judicial power, just as the Association of 1774 had given it legislative power. The canny Morris was keenly appreciative of the importance of precedent. Quote, "The power of government, as of man," he said, "is to be collected from small instances. Great affairs are more the object of reflection and policy. Here both join." End quote. Then continuing, Jensen, quote, time and again, the minority of nationalists who remained in Congress from 1776 tried to collect the power of government from small instances. One such instance was the report of a price-fixing convention in New England in 1777. The report was laid before Congress. James Wilson and others argued that the approval of Congress was necessary. Benjamin Rush stated flatly that this meeting had usurped the powers of Congress. The long metaphysical debate continued, for many of the revolutionary group were as well aware as the nationalists of the subtle power of precedent. So the real Federalists, Sam Adams, Richard Henry Lee, and Thomas Burke, opposed Wilson and Rush. Adams insisted that the right to assemble and discuss was the privilege of free men and feared only by tyrants. Richard Henry Lee drove home the point that it was the unconfederated Congress itself that had no legal power. So that was interesting because we see this very familiar pattern of the power here, or the people trying to arrogate power to a particular branch of government. In this case, judicial power to Congress, using this concept of precedent to create something out of nothing, where sovereignty didn't exist before, by creating a precedent where this decision can be made in this particular court case. And if that goes unchallenged, it means that the sovereignty does in fact lie with that power. We see the growth of judicial power under the Constitution in much of the same manner. So I thought that parallel from 250 odd years ago was quite interesting.
Right, and there's something else that's also important, especially for understanding everything that Jensen is telling us. These two sides, and we hammered on this quite a lot in the last two streams that we did from Jensen's other book. These two sides really form the political boundaries for the time. They're both American, but that does not mean that both have the interest of the Confederation or eventually the country in mind. So something that we actually, I think it's earlier in the book, so it might just be worth saying now, is that a lot of the more mercantile nationalistic factions wanted peace with Britain very early in the war, basically by whatever means necessary, to the point that French control over our foreign policy and peacemaking was ginormous, and it was very often the Federalists or the Radicals from the last book. And the Federalists in this book being roughly the same group that opposed this line of reasoning. And the purpose for that is simple. If you remember, Jensen's analysis all boiled down to class analysis. The mercantile nationalists stood to gain from peace, and especially so if certain territorial claims were given up. I don't know how much of that we really wanted to discuss, but it's worth pointing out that even though both sides are American here, they form the political divide. They don't really have the interest, especially in the long term of the country, in mind. One side was very insular and non-expansionist, shall we say.
Indeed. And why don't we continue page 44, continue exactly where I left off. Actually, I selected a lot from this section because it really encapsulates the general conflict of the time here. Quote, "In addition to those men who argued in general for a central sovereign authority, there were particular interests that stood to gain by the creation of such authority. The most persistent and pervasive were the land companies centering in the landless middle states, the Indiana, the Illinois, and the Wabash companies. They had appealed to centralized government, Great Britain, before the Revolution. They appealed to Congress once war began, and they got what they wanted in the Dickinson draft of Confederation, only to have it removed. They appealed also to Virginia. They were, in fact, ready to uphold either national or state sovereignty if by either means they could get the land they wanted. When Virginia's actions finally made it plain that there was little to be gained from her, representatives of these land companies evolved tenuous theories in support of the sovereignty of Congress in general and over Western lands in particular. An Indiana Company memorial in 1779, for instance, declared that the West had been set up as a separate government under the sovereignty of the king, and that now the jurisdiction over that land was in the hands of the whole United States and Congress assembled, in whom the sovereignty is now vested. Other memorials were even more explicit. One of them declared that all rights and all obligations of the Crown of Great Britain respecting the lands and governments devolve upon the United States and are to be claimed, exercised, and discharged by the United States Congress assembled. This subtle doctrine of devolution of sovereignty was the creation of the Nationalists, for such men as James Wilson and Robert Morris were leading members of the land companies. But no such doctrine, however subtle, could mislead the representatives of the landed states. And when Virginia denied all jurisdiction of Congress in such matters, William Trent replied for the Indiana and Vandalia companies with other frankness that the question of the jurisdiction of Congress was the very essence of their claims, and that it was of infinite consequence to the American Union as well as to your memorialists. End quote. So, yeah, here we see the struggle, but again, between the land companies and the ownership of the land, because they have claims on these Western lands, and this is showing us that these merchant powers, we might say, are basically, they have no real ideological position. Their only position is what gets us the land that we have purchased from the Indians, regardless of whether or not competing claims on that land exist. And the question here, the real question of the time we can see, is where does sovereignty lie? As we have read the Articles of Confederation and is borne out, the Articles of Confederation rested sovereignty in the hands of the states, but you have people arguing for the sovereignty of Congress. That's really the key difference here in the Articles as opposed to the Constitution, where in the Articles the states are unambiguously sovereign, and under the Constitution, Congress is unambiguously sovereign over the states, despite the 10th Amendments being added after the fact. We already went over in our previous stream, number 11 or 10, I think it was, where we covered the 10th Amendment versus the similar article in the Articles of Confederation. Anyway,
So
do you have anything to add there?
Yeah. There's also something else that's pretty important here, because a worry at the time was that if the land in the West was centralized, it would be delegated out in like a very aristocratic format, whereas the other side in which the land is kept would allow people to settle it much freer. So this is important, especially for anyone that has listened since the first few weeks of our streams here, because the West is really what forms the not just like the cultural backbone of the country, but also the character itself. Like it's very hard to imagine an American ethnos or an American nation without the people that settled the West to the extent that they did. This is what is up for debate here. Is basically how is the West going to be settled? And there was a great amount of worry that any sort of centralization of the West into the hands of a national or a central government would restrict that settlement, which in the long run would be quite inhibitive compared to our actual history. Just try to imagine the West being something that was restricted in settlement to a greater extent. It would cripple our identity. Still there? Hello, hello. Oh, okay, all right. Well,
I couldn't unmute for
go.
some reason, so I just had to refresh the tab. Yes, so I heard everything you said. The West, well, if you've been watching the streams from the very beginning, you will sort of see now how all of this is really tied together, which is actually quite interesting because the first few books we had planned well in advance, and this one was kind of in the list as a point of interest. And I find it interesting how all these themes are tying themselves together very consistently as we continue reading these books, these, you might say, forgotten books on our own history. So the character of the West, if the restrictionists had gotten their way, who knows where we would be now? Who knows whether or not the American nation would even extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean? Because you can imagine, sort of alternate history, and not to get too deep down this thread, but where perhaps Mexico had secured the territory of California to a much larger degree, given that, or Texas as well, if the United States had stayed restricted to east of the Mississippi for much longer. So let's go to page 45 now, and this will tell us about the second group of nationalists. So, quote, the second group supporting the demand for a strong national government were the public creditors, an even more vocal interest group created by the revolution. Great riches for them lay in the mass of depreciated paper used to finance the war if Congress could get and enforce the power of taxation. Despite the difficulties involved, the nationalist group did not look upon the debt as a handicap, but agreed with Hamilton, who declared in 1781, quote, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of our union, end quote. There was no novelty, even then, in this concept of a creditor group as a powerful nationalizing force. As early as May 1775, the New York Provincial Congress had concerned itself with currency problems and accepted a report drafted by Governor Morris. This report declared that Congress should control all currency. It went on to argue that wherever a paper currency has been emitted and obtained general credit, it will be a new bond of union to the associated colonies. And as the war neared its end, Governor Morris, Assistant Superintendent of Finance, wrote to John Jay, finance, my friend, the whole of what remains of the American Revolution grounds there. To Nathaniel Appleton in Massachusetts, Robert Morris declared that, quote, a public debt supported by public revenue will prove the strongest cement to keep our Confederacy together, end quote. It is thus evident that men saw a connection between centralization and the public debt during the Revolution. It is also evident that some of them looked upon the public debt and debt funding as involving more than economics or justice. Hamilton and Governor Morris early realized that the creditor group might be consolidated behind a movement for the imposition of a national government upon the states. End quote. So, yeah, here, I mean, I suppose the argument from the pro-nationalization creditor side, particularly from Hamilton, is that the collective owing of all of this money to some group of creditors would actually more tightly bind the states to one another. One of the hallmarks, I suppose, of this progressive view of history, which is what this is Jensen focuses not on ideological roots, but very much the material interests of the people involved, which I think makes this history very fascinating to us, because we're mostly taught in the 21st century or the 90s, in my case, how these different ideologies clashed with each other. You have Hamilton's ideology versus Sam Adams' ideology, but Jensen is showing us the material interests behind these men.
Right, and that's the entire point. That's the whole purpose of the progressive method of history. Because this will become very apparent whenever we get to Beard at some indeterminate point in the future, writing about the Constitution. He has less than positive things to say about it in some places, breaking through the mythology. It is very interesting here, and once again, it's the same insight that we had from the last book of Jensen's. It is still the very conservative or nationalistic merchant class that really does not have, once again, the nation or the people's interest in mind. They have their financial interest in mind. It is very interesting. Jensen is he doesn't fall into mythology, but if you remember earlier when talking about people like Adams and the Federalists that he's called in this book, or in the last book, the Radicals, he does point out that they had some extreme ideological motivations compared to the mercantile class. It's worth pointing out that the mercantile class, again, does not have the country's interest in mind. I would argue that this is still true today, and it must be kept in mind, especially when trying to build coalitions, grab power, and whatever else. That the mercantile class is very slippery. They they have, as a class at least, they have an interest, and it's not necessarily always going to be the nation, you, your people, or whatever else. This comes about again and again. Very few places, or very few writings of traditional morality, religion, or whatever else, would view a large debt as a good thing. In fact, usually it's viewed as terms of enslavement. But here you have the more nationalistic class arguing to indebt the entirety of the colonies or the states to draw them together under a central government.
One interesting thing about the nationalists, though, is we do have to consider their perspective and their view on what America was supposed to be, because it is another equally real part of our own history. So although Jensen is casting the nationalists consistently as the sort of villains in his own perspective, we must remember that they are another part of our heritage, and this view shouldn't necessarily be dismissed outright. Although I think the both of us, and previously with Mr. Quinn, the three of us definitely lean more towards the Federalist view. In fact, I still lean toward that view now, and it's probably the case, I would imagine, among most of our listeners. But it is important to the listeners not to simply write off people like Hamilton, even John Adams, or even Robert Morris as a villain, but to simply comprehend their perspective and place in our own history. So just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and this is very important, especially in the last few streams where we've talked more and more about sort of drawing inferences from these histories in our current times. Never demonize your own heritage like this, especially just for political points. This is something that we've sort of hammered on throughout the entirety of American Spirits. For example, I'm harshly critical of what the nationalists are doing here, but in the same way that I would not call myself a radical or a federalist or something due to it being antiquated, I'm not going to demonize the past generation of nationalists and centralizers. They are far gone. It would be purposeless, and it's my own history.
Indeed. Now, looking at another, I suppose, way things could have gone and way things could have been centralized, let's go to 47, and then I'll also read 49 really quickly. Quote, as things grew worse during the summer, the necessity of appointing General Washington the sole dictator of America was talked of more and more. The only way to stop such talk was to get money from the states, and this the opposition realized. Or else, as one of them said, we must expect frequent maggots about creating omnipotencies. We must have money at all adventures. Nothing else is wanting to raise us again into reputation and prevent stupid plans of creating absolute dictators to get supplies without paying for them. The opposition thus aroused was strong enough to bring the Congressional Committee back from camp. But once back in Congress, John Matthews of the committee made a motion to give to Washington absolute power to choose his own means to bring an army of 25,000 men into the field, to clothe, to arm, and equip that army, to appoint all its officers, and to try them and sentence them, to call on any state militia he might want. In addition to all this, he was to be vested with power to do all such other matters and things as shall appear to him necessary to promote the welfare of these United States, and to draw on the treasury of the United States for the sums of money as he needed to carry out such powers. Furthermore, Congress should agree to ratify everything he did. The only limitation on this breathtaking proposal was that the powers would end December 1st, 1781. And then quickly on page 49, quote, the resolutions of the Boston Convention met with hearty approval in New York. Some members of the legislature were for appointing a dictator, with a vice dictator in each state, invested with all powers conferred formally by the Roman people on theirs. General Schuyler fully expected to go to Hartford with instructions to propose that a dictator should be appointed. End quote. So I thought that was interesting. One was this particular line about promoting the welfare of the United States, which is a very controversial means through which power was attempted to and is now assigned to Congress. And then I also thought their own comparison to ancient Rome was fascinating. As we know, this is something that the founders are said to have done. This is sort of a meme in our history that some of them viewed themselves as being sort of in that tradition. So I thought it was worth selecting that bit on page 49 just to throw that in there.
Right, and this is actually something that like boomer cons will bring up. That's one of the few good points that they have, and that's very much to the nationalist credit here. If they really wanted a dictatorial, like mercantilist state or something, they very easily could have at least tried for it, if not have had it. So Jensen is very dismal about them, as are many other people, many other historians that I agree with and like. But I feel like a lot of that kind of bleeds over into unrealism, talking about how they were all trying to be dictators or something like that. I mean, when we're talking here about proposals for that to happen, the support is there. Washington could have made himself like a sort of an American Cromwell, and he didn't. It's very much a credit to them. Perhaps that's good for the audience to tone down the criticisms that the book or we have for the Nationalists ever so slightly, just because that possibility is there and yet was not seized.
Now, there were some interesting maneuvers by particularly Hamilton in order to perhaps bring something like that about. Let's look at page 50, and I will read about a letter that Hamilton wrote. So, quote, the outstanding expression of the Nationalists' political philosophy in 1780, the program they wanted, and the methods they were ready to use to establish themselves, came not from such conventions, but from the pen of Alexander Hamilton. He presented his program of action in the form of a letter to James Duane, one of the most consistent nationalists who was once more a member of Congress. The root of evil, said Hamilton, is that Congress lacks the power to act upon the states collectively. To get around this fact, he conjured up the idea that Congress should use undefined powers. Such powers could be limited only by the object of the establishment of Congress. This object Hamilton defined as the freedom and independence of America. The Confederation should be ignored since it had not been ratified, and furthermore, it was defective because of the idea it contained of the uncontrolled sovereignty in each state over its internal police. Congress must perform innumerable acts for the general good, which would interfere with this power of the states. There were two ways to get power. The first was to assume that Congress had once had and used discretionary power, limited only by the end for which it had been organized. Hamilton was too realistic to suppose that such an assumption would be accepted by the generality of Congress, and his second proposal showed that the Nationalists had learned much from radical tactics. Hamilton proposed that a convention be called and that it be given power to draw up and adopt a new government without reference to Congress, the states, or the people. This government would be a solid coercive union with complete sovereignty over the civil, military, and economic life of the 13 states. Its economic power was to be assured by permanent revenues in the form of land taxes, poll taxes, duties on trade, and the ownership of all unoccupied Western lands. End quote. So that's pretty interesting. It seems very modern, actually, what Hamilton was basically recommending there. Effectively just bypassing the existing government and signing a new government into existence without any reference to it. It's almost reminiscent of, in the other direction, how the Soviet Union was dissolved by Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, simply writing it out of existence and forming a new government with no reference to it.
The other thing that I find very interesting is that the justifications for it read like it's out of the 20th century. I don't really have much more qualitatively to add here, but this very much seems like what a lot of later American progressives in particular would argue was necessary. In fact, some still today, that more power is needed to be centralized in order to do good for the people in the country. It's a much older line of argument, I guess, than I was aware of before reading.
Yes, and I will continue on the machinations here. On page 51, quote, "In the meantime, Congress must take immediate steps to secure power. The committees in charge of foreign affairs, war, marine, trade, and finance must be replaced by single executives who should be men of the first abilities, property, and character in the continent. Another step was for Congress to consolidate behind it the power of the army, which, like the creditors, Hamilton described as an existential cement of the Union. The army should be reformed. Hamilton said it was a mob rather than an army, without clothing, without pay, without provisions, without morals, and without discipline. Congress could attach the army to it by providing clothing and giving the officers half pay for life. Congress would then have a solid basis of authority and consequence, for, to me, it is an axiom that in our Constitution, an army is essential to the American Union. Hamilton's readiness to use force, provided by the creditors and the army to achieve political ends, foreshadows the attempted coup d'etat of 1783, and is of a piece with the willingness of some of the Nationalists to use force to obtain their ends in 1787. By the end of 1780, the Nationalist group was once more in a position to influence the working of the central government in a significant fashion. The stresses of that year gave them the political justification for return to power in the states where they had lost control or been weakened. The war was going from bad to worse as the British marched northward relentlessly. Paper finance was at last brought to an end. The army had to depend on specific supplies from the states, and these were inadequate. The demand for strong men and strong measures grew more and more plausible as the hopes of Americans grew darker and darker. You would kind of see a typical, I suppose, story about how power is consolidated when times are particularly strenuous. The people who are able to argue for why centralization will solve the problems, in this case, the provisioning of the army, could be able to get their way.
I find it interesting, the parallels between Hamilton's plan and Prussian administration, basing the state around the creditors and the army. It's a very interesting connection, especially because due to basic things that everyone's taught in school and whatnot, Hamilton is slotted as an extreme Anglophile along with the rest of the Nationalists. But the administration that he's talking about here with like a Congress of creditors that controls money, credit, and all this other stuff, and then the state based around the military is an exceedingly Prussian system. I hadn't noticed those parallels, I guess, until now, really, because it didn't occur to me while I was reading through this. But it's a very interesting system that it would be proposed by one of the founders themselves to basically Prussianize the country.
Indeed, I had not noticed that either. Let's switch now to the topic of demobilization. And this is where we get more references to the figure of Robert Morris, who's another one of the men that Jensen likes to pick on, particularly in the last book as well. So on page 55, I will read, quote, "On the 10th of January 1781, Congress created the Department of Foreign Affairs with a Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He was to run the department and handle correspondence with foreign ministers and the American emissaries abroad, attend Congress to keep in touch with domestic affairs, and to keep the reports he might make from time to time. Here was the beginning of the form of a ministerial responsibility, since the Secretary was to be elected by Congress, held office at its pleasure, and must explain his actions before it. In February, Congress established the post of Secretary of War. He was to make reports and keep records of the armed forces, prepare estimates of supplies needed, and transmit the orders of Congress to the land forces of the United States. It was decided that the Secretary should be a general officer of the Army. On the same day, Congress established the Department of Finance. This became the keystone in the arch of all of executivism under Robert Morris, who in time became the all-powerful force in every department in Congress in the Army and wielded more power in the United States than any man had yet done. End quote. So basically, Congress is creating all of these offices here, and given that the system lacks a chief executive, these departments and secretaries that they're creating have unlimited power within their particular domain, insofar as they are not restricted by Congress itself or by argument from the Articles of Confederation itself. And of course, under the Department of Finance, Robert Morris actually becomes an extremely powerful man, as argued by Mr. Jensen here. Now, let me read a little more, unless you want to comment on Morris.
I was just going to say very briefly, it's interesting to see the evolution of the system just by looking at the beginning, because if you look at how at least Jensen describes the departments as being structured, the ultimate source of authority or power still comes from the Congress, which itself was there because the states decided for it to be there. It's almost a perfect inverse of the modern day, where you'll have a department do something and Congress may or may not call them in for questioning.
Now, continuing on page 56, quote, "Despite an undercurrent of opposition, Morris was elected unanimously. He said he did not want the post, and he laid down certain conditions that Congress must meet before he would accept it. He must be allowed to continue his own private business. He must appoint all officers in the department. He must have absolute power to appoint and dismiss anyone having anything to do with the spending of money. Unless he had such powers, he insisted that the business of reformation could not be managed. Furthermore, he demanded control of the financial affairs of the quartermaster, commissary, and medical departments of the army. Morris's supporters insisted that public necessity demanded so sweeping a grant of power, and Congress finally agreed to all the conditions. Morris himself denied that he liked power for its own sake, while his friends hailed him as the savior of the country." End quote. Now, I think, and on page 59, we'll get into, the business of him being almost dictatorial in the sweeping breath of his power. I think his accumulation of power seems to have much more to do with his own financial interests. At least that's how Jensen argues it, rather than anything nefarious like actually being a dictator or something. But the issue that his opponents have is the fact that he's able to basically leverage all of the financial power of the United States to the benefit of himself and his friends. From one point of view, it's hard to argue with that, but at the other end, you're looking at the people who are responsible for, effectively the welfare of the entire nation.
It is, once again, it's very dangerous to have the merchant class in charge.
I think that's the key takeaway with Morris. It's, yes, having the merchants in charge is dangerous. They simply are far too steeped in their own interests rather than the interests of the people. Actually, ironically, a problem I'm dealing with right now locally. Continuing on page 59. Quote, "But from 1781 to 1783, such doings and resolutions in Congress were not as important as those of a single man, Robert Morris. It was around him, his satellites, and their activities that the government really revolved. Morris's power was described by Joseph Reed when he said that Mr. Morris was inexorable, Congress at mercy, and since his appointment, the business of that august body has been extremely simplified, Mr. Morris having relieved them from all business of deliberation or executive difficulty with which money is in any respect connected, and they are now very much at leisure to read dispatches, return thanks, pay and receive compliments, etc. For form's sake, some things go thither and to receive a sanction, but it is the general opinion that it is form only." And then page 60, we'll continue on Morris. Quote, while Morris had been elected in February and accepted the post in May 1781, he did not take over the office officially until September, about a month before Yorktown. Meanwhile, Congress handed over one portion of sovereign power after another to the superintendent of finance. In May, it authorized him to establish a bank. In June, it placed in his hands all the money borrowed in France during 1781 and all the unsold bills of exchange. In July, it gave him power to import and export goods on the account of the United States. In July and later, Congress placed the whole Department of Marine under his control. At the same time, he was authorized to supply the army by means of private contracts and to dispose of specific supplies received from the states as he saw fit. In October, he was authorized to correspond with the foreign ministers of the United States, and thus, in effect, a separate Department of Foreign Affairs was set up under his control. For all practical purposes, Morris was made a dictator by Congress. Joseph Reed called him a pecuniary dictator and said that the qualities required for the job were ability of mind, some money in hand, and a private credit for more. As superintendent of finance and private businessman at one and the same time, Morris's chief concern was with providing Congress with funds. His first proposal was the organization of a bank. There had been much talk of such a bank, with the Bank of England as an example, etc. So, yeah, I think that's all I had on Morris. But yeah, the lesson here is don't put the merchants in charge. Morris goes about setting up the first national bank, which of course he is one of the great beneficiaries. We can see here how he basically had complete control over the supplies that went to the army. He had control over imports and exports. He was given power to create a bank. He was effectively given his own Department of Foreign Affairs. I think it's probably a bit of an exaggeration to call him a dictator, but it's certainly approaching that. It's actually, I would say, approaching it much more than even Washington himself approached being any sort of dictator, especially being that he only had command authority over one army. And of course, his command was pretty flimsy at that, considering the near and sometimes minor mutinies that occurred due to lack of pay. So it really was the man with the money, in this case Morris, who had the most power in the states during this period.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out as well. Even though the Congress gave him assent for doing all this, he was hotly contested in other spheres of American life at this point in time. And there's a good chunk of historians that do not look kindly on him still. Now, the positive reading for him is that he did do good enough of a job that we were independent. The country did not dissolve after independence into squabbles. We weren't conquered by foreign power. So that is an accomplishment. But it is interesting. Something that many people like to do is look at the goals, objectives, and principles that led to Americans politically separating from Britain, and then compare to what Americans tolerate later. And in this case, it has been scarcely 5-6 years since political separation during the war, and the colonies and the Congress are tolerating, at least politically, the finances being entirely centralized into one merchant. It's not explicitly something that they fought against, but one struggles to see how it accords with the overall ideals that were that were being pursued, especially by the radicals that actually got things going, as we discussed in the previous two streams on Jensen.
Indeed. Now let's move to page 78. I will mention Hamilton again. So this is a really interesting bit here where Hamilton is sort of suggesting that military force be used in order to bring about things the way he would like to see. So this section discusses a few things Hamilton wrote, but I will just quote this one part about a specific letter. Quote, but with this he sent another letter written, Quote, as a citizen zealous for the true happiness of this country, as a soldier who feels what is due to an army which has suffered everything and done much for the safety of America, end quote. He stated flatly that the army's distrust of Congress was justified, that some men still wanted to use force, that he himself would be inclined to use it if he thought it would get results. The army must submit to its hard fate if the country is ungrateful. Quote, Republican jealousy has in it a principle of hostility to an army, whatever be their merits, whatever be their claims to the gratitude of the community. It acknowledges their services with unwillingness and rewards them with reluctance. End quote. If the army seeks redress by force of arms, they will be ruined. It would molder of its own weight for want of means of keeping together. The soldiers would desert their officers. Quote, there would be no chance of success without having recourse to means that would reverse our revolution, end quote. Such observations are made to show why. Quote, I cannot myself enter into the views of coercion which some gentlemen entertain, for I confess could force avail, I should almost wish to see it employed. I have an indifferent opinion of the honesty of this country, ill forebodings as to its future system, end quote. So that's pretty funny. I mean, it's pretty obvious that he's sort of saying, well, you know, if Congress isn't, because this whole part is about the issue of the army being paid toward the end of the war. As things are wrapping up, they need to be paid, and Hamilton is kind of like, well, you know, I would get it if the army used force. Maybe even I could see doing it myself if I was in their position. So before we comment on that, I will read the sort of response to it, and this is coming from Washington on page 79. Quote, to Hamilton, Washington was far more explicit. The picture in Hamilton's letters he viewed, quote, with astonishment and horror. The idea of a redress by force is too chimerical to have a place in the imagination of any serious mind in this army. But there is no telling what unhappy disturbances might result from distress and distrust of justice, end quote. Both Washington and many of the officers were suspicious of the politicians. Some of the leading officers were convinced that the army was being used, quote, as mere puppets to establish continental funds, end quote. Robert Morris was suspected of being at the bottom of it. If such a suspicion became general in the army, it would oppose the whole scheme. The army, Washington warned, is a dangerous instrument to play with. Its just aim should be settled, and it should be disbanded without delay. Washington was truly alarmed at what might happen if the scheming continued between the group at Congress and his discontented officers. He was particularly suspicious of Governor Morris, whom he had blamed for the Newburgh affair, although he seems not to have suspected Hamilton and General Henry Knox, who were also involved. Like Knox, Hamilton disclaimed responsibility with an air of wide-eyed innocence. Hamilton was anxious to allay Washington's doubts and went at length into the politics of Congress. He defended Robert Morris against all charges. He insisted that it was the same old Lee Dean factionalism at work, and that Morris was hated because he had been on Dean's side. Then, with entire truth, he declared that, quote, there are two classes of men, sir, in Congress of very different views. One attached to state, the other to continental politics. The last have been strenuous advocates for funding the public debt upon solid securities. The former have given every opposition in their power and have only been dragged into the measures which are now being adopted by the clamors of the army and other public creditors, end quote. He summed up by assuring Washington that the men he suspected were, quote, in general, the most sensible, the most liberal, the most independent, and the most respectable characters in our body, as well as the most unequivocal friends to the army. In a word, they are the men who think continentally, end quote. So that's pretty interesting because you have Hamilton and his faction sort of playing with the idea of the army using force. It's sort of an appeal, I suppose, to the officers. But clearly, according to Jensen and his citations, Washington not only views the idea as ridiculous, the idea that, you know, the army would basically do a coup or something for Hamilton's ideological position, when really they just wanted to be paid and go home. You know, there was no chance of the army doing some sort of nationalist takeover over the government, which he, is chiding Hamilton for. They just want to be paid.
There's a there's a big opportunity here for him to have been a Cromwell, and he wasn't, which, given other military dictatorships around the same time period in the Americas, I think that was very much to our benefit.
Yeah, and I think it certainly speaks highly of Washington that he in no way entertained anything like that, because he absolutely could have. I'm sure he could have, if he had really wanted to, put this sentiment forward to the army that the use of force would be necessary for them to achieve what they were looking for, which was to wrest their salaries from Congress, basically. But he did not do that. Now let's see. I have the resolution of this incident quoted. I think. Do we need to go into that? Would you like me to read those quotes about how the situation with the army resolved?
I don't. I mean, the fact that there was no takeover, I think, is the biggest thing to point out here. Unless there's something in particular you wanted to point out. While you were thinking about that, though, I did have a point that came to mind that would be useful for us, perhaps. With the, I don't mean to be too normie or whatever else, but the idea of a nonpartisan or a politically neutral army, except for like the existence of the nation, I suppose, in this sense, is very important, just because basically in every other uprising this seems to be destroyed very early on. I really do think here that it's quite something that the progressive historian is making Washington out to be. Maybe not this far-seeing politician, maybe with ideas of national stability, but at least sensible enough to not coup the country with the army and politicize it and whatnot else. I do think that, especially in our circles, as people drifted away from normie-con and other sort of normal lines of dialogue, these facts have been lost and their weight has been lost, when in actuality this is very important for the character and the heritage of the country. And the fact that it's not this way today should be an outcry for redress, just because we had something that wasn't like this and it was unique and it was ours. So that was just something that came to my mind. I don't know. Do you want to? I don't
No,
have
I
a
think
reason to go into the resolution.
let's go to page 82, and I will summarize the events here. So, what the Nationalists were trying to do was keep the army in the field so that it could be something they could utilize, not even necessarily for force, but this national entity that brought the entire country together. This is what sort of their view for it, that it mixed together all the people of the different states and turned them into Americans rather than people of their individual states so much. And they were trying to make Washington keep the army in the field while they were still waiting to be paid. So you're basically saying that these men can't go home, but we're not actually paying you yet. And the officers were becoming, loud and insolent, as is quoted here, and they want to go home. They want to go home and they want to be paid, and they're certainly not going to stay in camp if they're not being paid. So what ends up happening is the army does disband. Reading towards the end of a bit I have here, quote, thus the army disappeared as a force to be reckoned with in politics and war. And then reading what we have on screen, quote, the Nationalist failure to keep the army in being was part of their failure to establish a peacetime military establishment. James Madison, Hamilton, James Wilson, Samuel Osgood, and Oliver Ellsworth were appointed to a committee to deal with such matters. Stephen Higginson reported that, quote, there are those also among us who wish to keep up a large force, to have a large garrison, to increase the navy, to have a large diplomatic corps, to give large salaries to all our servants. Their professed view is to strengthen the hands of government, to make us respectable in Europe, and I believe they might add to divide amongst themselves and their friends every place of honor and profit. But it is easy to see where all this will lead us, and Congress, I think, is not yet prepared for such systems. End quote. One interesting bit there was this idea of being respectable in Europe. This is a sort of need some people in early America have this need to be recognized by Europe as being a respectable state. Um, I think in some ways that's actually reversed at, I suppose, the normie level. Europeans tend to look to America for the way to go about things. And obviously, a lot of Europeans of the right wing or nationalist persuasion don't like that, understandably. And in terms of this theme in early America, it's probably was not to our benefit, I would say, to overly look to Europe for how to do things, as sort of one of the points was to of the new world versus the old world is this fresh slate, this democratic slate where something new could be made without the pitfalls of the old ways. What do you think, Ryan?
Well, yeah, I mean, this explicitly goes against, especially when we went over Thomas Paine, we talked about this a lot. The continental Americans are supposed to be something new, better, and separate from the old European system. I mentioned at the start that there's some sort of Spenglerian tie-ins to a lot of this. If I remember correctly, in a previous stream, Charlemagne, you mentioned that sort of like the online right has adopted this meme that this meme idea of Spengler's civilizations and cultures and whatnot, and grouped the Americans fully into the Faustian civilization, culture, spirit, whatever you want to talk about it. And I think this is very interesting here, and in later parts of the book where Jensen really talks about the sort of cultural flourishing, the explosion of creativity and whatnot else that happened after independence and under this Articles of Confederation, because it's a very distinct obviously it's European derived, especially as we talked about in the first two streams of American Spirits, but it is not specifically European. We are recognizing ourselves to be Americans. We had heritage from Europe. It was given to us. It was celebrated and whatnot else. But there's this idea that our civilization and culture, not in Spenglerian terms now, our civilization and culture was something entirely different, something new that was over here, combining both of our heritage with what we could actually develop as Americans. This is sort of what you're seeing here in sort of the other side of that, trying to look to Europe, modeling ourselves off of Europe. I mentioned earlier that Hamilton seemed to have wanted to Prussianize the country. He was suggesting an army coup. Not included in the book was Washington's efforts to sort of Europeanize the military. There is a current, especially among the more conservative faction here, trying to keep America within the European sphere, within the European cultural sphere. I don't know. We'll talk about this later, if not now, definitely next stream. That this did not necessarily succeed. This effort to make us very European. It is just interesting, though, and I think it lends credence to the idea that you had that we weren't fully Faustian, that there's even a conflict here between how European we were supposed to be.
Yeah, my view is that we're an entirely separate civilization in the Spenglerian terms. That could be argued. I think in general, though, I mean, one of the things that should be obvious now to listeners of American Spirits is we're not really looking at esotericism here. We're looking at grounded, foundational histories of the American people, and we're not really overdoing it or even dipping in much at all into these esoteric views. So I think that is sort of by the by.
I mean, more to the reading of what we had here. Something that would be interesting to comment on is that they want a permanent standing army. This faction, we did not, and I would personally say, thankfully, have a permanent standing army. If you want to draw parallels within history, politically, the nationalists here sound very much like the New Dealers and the post-war New Dealers, which I hope we can cover in a future stream sometime soon. And it's the same. The reason why they sound similar is not necessarily because they have like the same ideology. They're separated by many years. It is because they both see, for different reasons, the centralization of the state, the binding of the states together into one unified being. They view these things to be good for one reason or another. So, I would recommend the audience try to draw parallels there with the more recent New Dealers. You can see the parallels, and it's because of this philosophy which exists within American culture and society that centralization is good for itself. Um, this especially as we go further into American history, this is going to be a lot of the fights that happen in American history. You need to understand why that is. And it's this ideal of how centralized should the country be. That's what most of the political fights can be broken down to until now, where the political fight is just existential, heritage versus non-heritage.
We'll get deeper into this question of Europe. Actually, the book, despite what we've covered, is not purely this sort of political history, but it also gets into social aspects, the arts, novels, histories. The next part or next chapter is actually about that. I have a few things selected from it. One on page 90, which again touches on this justification by way of Europe. Quote, by 1786, the boasts and prophecies were bolstered by assertions of achievements. Franklin's philosophy was declared to have the unrivaled admiration of every country in Europe. The moral scrutinies of John Edwards had the applause of most Protestant countries, even of those opposed to his opinions. The quadrant, injuriously called Hadley's, was the invention of Mr. Godfrey of Philadelphia. Mercurial inoculation was the discovery of the late Dr. Merson. Trumbull's Buffingall was ranked along with Hudibras by English reviewers. The painters, Copley and West, found little competition even in Europe. The memorials of Congress were classed in Europe, along with the best of their kind ever published. European praise of our military and political characters renders our own applause totally unnecessary to their glory. Of no other nation can so honorable things be mentioned at so early a period of their existence. The following year, an essay on American genius declared that the time had come to explode the European creed that we are infantile in our acquisitions and savage in our manners, because we are inhabitants of a new world, lately occupied by a race of savages. The writer then proceeded to review the achievements of living Americans. He pointed to Ramsey's History of the Revolution in South Carolina as an example, and urged further writing on the military history of the Revolution. The writer's main concern, however, was with the fine arts. Americans have a strong talent for painting. Benjamin West of Philadelphia is one of the first historical painters of the age. John Singleton Copley of Boston, in the same walk of genius, is not spoken of as second to any of the profession. John Trumbull of Connecticut, though a younger man, has exhibited the happiest dispositions. So you can see various exhortations of the great achievements of the American people occurring immediately after the Revolution completed, with comparisons and claims. We could just say, who knows what was the real case, but claims on how American fine arts and histories were being received within the European states. I doubt there was quite as much admiration at most levels than the writers of those various quotes would have believed, but certainly there was some. Now, let's get to Noah Webster. So I have some quotes about Noah Webster, which are interesting, because we discussed Webster in our H.L. Mencken stream, and I thought it might be an interesting tie back to look at Webster's views on the Confederation and the Constitution, which he did have. So there's a couple pages on Webster. This is a quote from Webster from a speller he published in 1783. So, quote, in its preface, Webster wrote a manifesto in behalf of America in which he said, quote, the author wishes to promote the honor and prosperity of the Confederated Republics of America, and cheerfully throws his mite into the common treasure of patriotic exertions. This country must in some future time be distinguished by the superiority of her literary improvements, as she is already of the liberality by the liberality of her literary improvements as she is already by the liberality of her civil and ecclesiastical constitutions. Europe has grown old in folly, corruption, and tyranny. In that country, laws are perverted, manners are licentious, literature is declining, and human nature debased. For America, in her infancy, to adopt the present maxims of the old world would be to stamp the wrinkles of decrepit age upon the bloom of youth and to plant the seeds of decay in a vigorous constitution. American glory begins to dawn at a favorable period and under flattering circumstances. We have the experience of the whole world before our eyes, but to receive indiscriminately the maxims of government, the manners and literary taste of Europe, and to make them the ground on which to build our systems in America, must soon convince us that a durable and stately edifice can never be erected upon the moldering pillars of antiquity. It is the business of Americans to select the wisdom of all nations as the basis of her constitutions, to avoid their errors, to prevent the introduction of foreign vices and corruptions, and check the career of her own, to promote virtue and patriotism, to embellish and improve the sciences, to diffuse a uniformity and purity of language, to add superior dignity to this infant empire and to human nature. End quote. So a couple of things were interesting in there. One, the word Americans italicized. Webster has a very national perspective on America in 1783, mind you, right at the beginning of the Confederation period. He also, I notice, uses the word empire to describe what America is, an infant empire, but an empire nonetheless. So very early on, you can sort of see this concept, this national, this imperial view of America being strongly I guess you can even say propagandized by one of its key literary figures. Let me just continue on Webster really quick. There's one more quote.
Before you do, though, this is a very interesting to me. I know we said we weren't going to do esoterica, so I'll keep this as exoteric as possible. If it is true that America is like a separate culture or a separate civilization, it would make sense then at this time, especially during the articles, for a sort of an explosion of high culture, philosophy, literary and language advances, and whatnot else to be made. It would fit within the structure perfectly. So something to consider for people that have read that line of reasoning.
Yeah, and I think those structures are valid, certainly. So I certainly don't have anything against them. Let's see. Yeah, page 106. So continuing on Webster, he's published a grammar. Quote, the grammar was published in 1784, the reader in 1785, and Webster was launched on a career as one of the most successful textbook writers in the history of the world. The Speller was the most popular. In 1837, Webster estimated that 15 million copies had been sold. By 1890, the number was 60 million, and happy publishers do not find it unsaleable even at present. Meanwhile, Webster pamphleteered for the Congressional Impost, the commutation of army pay, and judicial reform. In 1785, he published Sketches of American Policy, in which he declared that representative democracy was the most perfect system of government. He demanded a new model, central government, with the power to make laws and force the states to obey them. Without such power, the Confederation could never be more than a burlesque on government. So, end quote. So, yeah, we see Webster loves representative democracy, but it must be a centralized model. And he actually was a political activist in a sense, in a strong sense, actually, and promoted centralized government. Page 107, I've got a little bit more on what Webster was doing. Quote, when Webster got to Charleston, he advised his Grammatical Institute as, quote, an attempt of an American to ascertain the pronunciation of the English language, end quote. He said that 20,000 copies had been sold in the northern states in the 18 months since publication. Webster declared that his books, quote, will encourage genius in this country, and the Empire of America will no longer be indebted to a foreign kingdom for books to learn the children of their native language. end quote. With canny practicality, he gave several hundred copies of his Speller and Grammar to a committee engaged in the founding of a new college. The advertising and goodwill he got as a result made his books standard in South Carolina. He returned to Baltimore, where he tried to start a school. When this failed, he offered to teach singing. His success was so great that after his first public concert, he got a large class. The life of a singing teacher was hopelessly frustrating for a man of Webster's ambitions. He now decided to become a lecturer in order to spread the gospel of an American language and to sell his books. He got the idea after listening to a blind man to give a lecture on light. He wrote 5 lectures on the history of the English language, pronunciation, errors in the use of words, and on education. In these letters, he urged the principles set forth in his text, in particular the idea that popular speech and common usage should determine the rules rather than ideas taken from arbitrary, and particularly from English, compilers of dictionaries. End quote. So that was mostly just a callback to some of what we've previously discussed, although you'll notice Empire of America appearing again at the beginning of what I read.
I do find this interesting because it's there's a major callback to especially our American language stream where we were talking about the American language being sort of a counter to the very top-down, standardized, and hierarchical nature that the English variant of English was brought about at this time period. Which makes it all the more interesting that Webster was campaigning for a more centralized form of government, even though his understanding of language, culture, and whatever else was the opposite. It was naturally emerging and whatnot else. So, it is interesting that a lot of these people, especially on the more politically centralized side, were not full-fledged centralizers. They did not view, say, the domain of language or necessarily culture or anything else as something to be centralized. It represents a very unpoliticized culture, such that you could imagine the language, unlike today, being outside of the domain of politics.
Now, Webster does sort of change his mind here. So if we move on to page 108, quote, Webster was lecturing in Massachusetts at the outbreak of Shays' Rebellion. Once more, he wrote essays for the newspapers. He denounced villainous legislatures and demanded law and order. He attacked schemes for paper money in New England and again urged a national union. Where a short year before he had praised representative democracy as the best of all forms of government, he now declared that people were too ignorant to manage their own affairs. Quote, this is the misfortune of Republican governments. For my own part, I confess, I was once as strong a Republican as any man in America. Now, a Republican is among the last kinds of government I should choose. I would infinitely prefer a limited monarchy, for I would sooner be the subject of the caprice of one man than to the ignorance and passions of the multitude, end quote. Back in Hartford, he was no longer popular. He was broke and there was no room for more lawyers, so he set off for New York. From there, he went to Philadelphia, where he talked with Franklin about his schemes for simplified spelling. Although he could get no audiences for his lectures, he was in the thick of politics, now wholeheartedly on the side of the Nationalists. He made only one error. He came out against the speculators in public funds. He thought that the original holders of public debt should be paid in full, and that the speculators should get only what they had paid plus interest. He was wildly accused of being a fomenter of rebellion, but he defended himself and republished his diatribes against paper money to show that he was sound, end quote. The devious merchants and creditors once again crushing a man's political ambitions. I would say that although Webster did have a view on the American language that was sort of bottom up, he did believe in a sort of national American standard contra an English standard of the language. So he has sort of one foot in both worlds there. But
right, and that's what's so interesting about his fall here that's being described, is that he almost in many cases sounds like he should be fully on the nationalist side. And then he comes out against the class interest of most of the nationalists.
Exactly.
This is interesting because if the nationalists were not merchants at their heart, Like, this is perfect. You have Webster, this guy who's single-handedly trying to create a distinct and unified American culture, at the very least, recognizing a distinct American language across the colonies. And he's come over mostly to your side. What do you do with him? Well, the non-merchant version of the Nationalist would absolutely use him to create their unified identity. But since, once again, the Nationalists are merchants, they just ruin the man. It's fascinating from a control perspective or a political perspective that they just let that opportunity go because he threatened the money. Fascinating.
Indeed, because Webster clearly was a true believer in whatever ideological beliefs he had about the national unity of America. But it's quite clear in this case that the nationalist side was not really about the ideology or even national interest in regards to national unity, but it was very much about, well, creditors and speculators and the merchant class receiving their profits. At least I think Jensen makes that case quite well. Let's wrap up on Webster. One more short thing on page 109. Quote, once the Constitution of 1787 was presented to the public, Webster pamphleteered for its adoption. He then decided to start a magazine. All the large towns except New York had one, so to New York he went and founded the American Magazine. It was soon one of the best. Webster's writing was vigorous, his interests were wide, and he was careless of the toes he trod on. But he lost money, and within a year he went back to Hartford to practice law. At the age of 31, after many failures as a suitor, he was married. Within a few years, he was back in New York as a newspaper editor, only to give it up and return once more to Connecticut. His name was known everywhere, but his great career was yet ahead of him. Once settled in New Haven, he took up the study of language in earnest. The first result was a dictionary published in 1806, and the final outcome was the first edition of an American Dictionary of the English Language in 1828. His battles and projects continued to be many. Most of them are forgotten today, but no man could hope for more enduring monuments than the blue-backed speller and Webster's Dictionary. End quote. So, just a bit of praise for a great American. I like that bit of the book, although there were a few other figures in the arts which I'm less familiar with, so I went with Webster there, particularly due to his particular nationalist leanings. But if you're interested, I mean, there's a lot more of this cultural stuff in the book.
Yeah, right. Whenever I mentioned it earlier, this is Jensen thinks this is a great time for American cultural flourishing, contrary to what I think absolutely every American student is taught about the Articles of Confederation period. So,
Yeah,
pretty cool.
that's really the key here is that yes, American culture is actually flourishing during this period. It is not stymied or inhibited by the lack of a national government because everything we just read and many other things regarding the fine arts and histories being written were actually happening during this period immediately after the end of the war. Okay, so we'll wrap up with a little bit of stuff on the development of the West and of the cities. I have a quote on page 110. Was labeled 110. It's actually page 109. Let's see. I think we have some time. I may as well just read this. Quote, the writers who were stimulated by the creation of a new nation made a vigorous contribution to the thought and life of the 1870s. Most of them were dubious about, if not violently opposed to, the political democracy that was either expressed or implicit in the action of state governments. Yet they still believed in the promise made possible by independence. David Ramsay, in his History of the American Revolution, summed up those beliefs and analyzed the progress since the beginning of the Revolution. He decried democratic excesses, as did other members of his social group, and hailed the Constitution of 1787 as a check upon democratic action. He believed that the Revolution gave America virtues as well as vices. It broke down localism. When the war began, quote, the Americans were a mass of husbandmen, merchants, mechanics, and fishermen, but the necessities of the country gave a spring to the active power of the inhabitants, and set them on thinking speaking and acting in a line far beyond that to which they had been accustomed. The difference between nations is not so much owing to nature as to education and circumstance. End quote. The leading strings of the mother country were broken at the outset, and Americans then had to carry on the work of civil society by themselves. The Continental Army helped break down barriers. Intermarriages were taking place. Bigotry was being destroyed by the disestablishment of state churches. Schools and colleges were closed by the war, yet many arts and sciences, such as geography, were promoted by it. The need of defense resulted in the invention of a machine for submarine navigation, and of sundry and other curious machines for the annoyance of British shipping. Surgeons had learned more in a day on the field of battle than they could in years of peace. The Revolution had diffused knowledge of the science of government among Americans. Mistakes were made, but they had learned much, particularly of the folly of unbalanced constitutions and injudicious laws. End quote. What do you think on this perspective, Ryan?
Well, so this is I wrote down notes last week to talk about a lot of so the thing that I do not like, that is very difficult, is the if you read the primary sources for this era, there is a drive to destroy local identity because it is seen as stifling, which if you come from a nationalist perspective, that makes sense. You're trying to break down the local and state identities into one unified American identity. However, so that's bad from my perspective, at least. Something that is interesting, though, and this is somewhat positive, that I would say. The author here and the people he's quoting, they do sort of attribute the American cultural flourishing to being politically independent, which I do think that's an interesting theory. I'm not a massive historical theorist, but this is something that I find interesting, especially from a nationalist perspective, in the political philosophy sense, like the idea that a nation should be independent and self-ruling. That as soon as the Americans actually get their own society, the culture flourishes. I will say, and this is a credit to what's in the excerpt. Attributing a national identity instead of to like a coercive political system, kind of like what Hamilton was designing, to a shared struggle, is very much a positive. And I think that's perhaps the most defensible and positive nationalist or centralizing idea to come out of this whole thing. I don't know that I want to delve into too much else there, but those are the thoughts that immediately come to mind. This idea that a sort of like a national identity and political independence for the nation both emerge and lead to a cultural outburst. That's really all that I have for that.
Yeah, there's also this perspective framed there that the localism was bad, and the fact that the individual American nations were kind of destroyed and turned into America rather than their constituent states as individual nations was actually a good thing. It's a perspective that I don't hold myself, but it's interesting to note that Americans at the time, including people whose names you'd recognize, had this belief that the sort of, I guess you'd to use a kind of glib term, a sort of melting pot occurred, and this was actually to be promoted very deliberately to form this unified nationality. So, it's like America should be independent of other powers, but it should be one power rather than a confederation of many powers. Okay, let's again tie some of this back to Western development, as I said we were going to do in order to close out the stream. So the next screenshot I have is 112. Okay. Quote, both the Americans and Europeans were aware of the promise of the vast areas of unoccupied lands in the Ohio Valley, and writer after writer told of the movement of people to the frontiers. Those who had fled from the frontiers at the outset of war started back on the news of peace. In April 1783, a report from Albany said that, quote, the roads are daily filled with their removals, end quote. In the fall of the same year, another report said that the, quote, rage for land here exceeds all conception, and the influx of people from the East is so great that this kind of speculation is the object of every person who has the means to embark on it. End quote. Dr. Edward Bancroft, renegade Yankee and British spy, wrote from Philadelphia late in 1783 that, quote, multitudes of people are gone and going over the Allegheny Mountains to settle near the Ohio, end quote. He expected great disorders from the licentious, ungovernable temper of the interior habitants of America. A Frenchman described the same movement. The new Westerners would form into, quote, free societies, end quote, where when there were enough of them, and he doubted they would ever be subject to Congress. He saw no gain in the movement except for the, quote, unhappy of Europe, end quote, particularly those from Britain and Germany who might succeed in escaping from government oppression and the burden of public debt. A letter from Ireland said that a shipload of young fellows, mechanics and artificers, was leaving because of the heavier taxes, too impatient to wait for better times at home, end quote. So, yeah, this is ties into what we were talking about on previous streams, which is this expansion westward, and it's interesting to see how it immediately sprung into action at the close of the revolution in an apparently massive quantity. And one of the problems, as we will shortly see, is the fact that these people were effectively seeking independence from Congress or their states or whatever powers were now making impositions on them. You know, this is a common theme, as we've seen the East Coast elites having power over their people and trying to exert it further and further west, and how there were massive disputes over who would own and control this land. Certainly, the national powers wanted to control it and wanted to prevent people from forming independent societies out there. Let's see, page 114, quote, John Jay, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, did not trust his fellow Americans who were moving westward. Yet in 1785, he said that, quote, a rage for emigrating to the western country prevails, and thousands have already fixed their habitations in that wilderness. The Continental Land Office is opened, and the seeds of a great people are daily planting beyond those mountains, end quote. 2 years later, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson that, quote, the enterprise of our countrymen is inconceivable, and the number of young men daily going down to settle in the western country is further proof of it, end quote. Yet he feared the western country would one day give trouble, and questioned whether the people there would be fit to govern themselves after 2 or 3 generations. Robert Morris said that his acquaintances were of the opinion that emigrations from the middle states to the western country are already so great as to be injurious, and therefore they did not want to encourage it in any way, end quote. So, yeah, you can see the nationalist versus the federalist perspective here, as well as the moneyed powers versus the interior, and the suspicion and sort of downward opinion that the urban and coastal powers have over the interior populations. Of course, as we know from reading Albion Sea, these people were very capable of governing themselves and did so in their own unique but effective ways.
Right. This is a thing that I find perhaps most pernicious about the centralizing system, just on a cultural level, is that as we established in our first 5 streams or so, a lot of the very unique and refined parts of American society, civilization, and culture came out of this the fact that the people, the ethnos, was just left alone for so long and allowed to develop, govern, and flourish on its own. And then you have the opportunity to continue that on the West, only for, once again, the the standardizing or centralizing merchant class, the class that is trying to unify the country into one singular nation and culture, to sort of deny the people descended from that old system the opportunity to continue it. It's I suppose perhaps that's the last critique of that I'll issue for this, but it's somewhat depressing to me that that's just lost as the state continues to centralize. It's not the end here in the book, but this is what the system of control is gunning towards, is full control over the West and the incorporation of the West into the rest of the country, into sort of like a monoculture.
Now, the last screenshot I have is on page 115, and I won't read the whole thing for time mainly, but I just wanted to point out the population of the cities which grow at this time. And the immigrants were coming into these places as well from Europe. So, let's see. The quote, the 5 great cities of the United States were Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, and Baltimore. One can make only rough estimates of their population at the beginning of the war. Philadelphia, the metropolis of the mainland colonies, had at least 30,000 in 1776. New York, perhaps 22,000. Boston, 16,000. Charleston, 14,000. And Baltimore, 6,000. End quote. The census of 1790 is a clear index to the rapid growth of cities after 1775. It showed that Philadelphia and New York had grown by a third in 15 years, and that Baltimore had more than doubled. Other American towns had grown proportionally, end quote. So we're seeing and that's it for the screenshots I have, but we see a massive growth in the cities at the same time. And there are, of course, Germans, there are Scots, there are Irish, there are people from Holland coming into the cities at these times. There are competitions for power within the cities. Many of them are still using the town hall methodology of city government, but now they begin incorporating, which is a means by which a smaller group, one might say aristocrats, can run the town and be less subject to democratic forces. That is the way Jensen describes it. One interesting case we will look at particularly is Philadelphia and Boston, mainly Boston, where incorporation was resisted. So on page 119, I'll read, quote, the greatest battle came in Boston, where the town meeting idea was so firmly embedded that it could not be overturned for decades. The movement got underway in 1784 and was backed by a great number of very respectable gentlemen. When the town met in May, the hall was packed. The governor, lieutenant governor, and several other gentlemen of distinction were present. A long debate was not without a small degree of tartness. Joseph Barrel, a wealthy merchant, talked at length of the need of incorporation. He declared that the police system was bad and could be improved only by handing the government over to a mayor, alderman, and councilman. This would save both time and money, for the citizens had spent at least a tenth of their time in town meetings during the past 8 years. He said that he had no self-interest in the matter, but was concerned only for the good of his fellow citizens. Sam Adams, for long the great leader and manipulator of Boston town meetings, then rose to defend it in one of the few of his speeches which we actually have a record. He denied that change was necessary. The present constitution of the town had more than a century of experience behind it. A change of measures, rather than of government, would take care of the grievances. The new plan carried with it the appearance and might, in its consequences, be instrumental to the introduction of aristocracy, a government of all others, he said, the worst. A love of novelty and the desire for change in other nations had been the avenue by which aristocracy had entered, and he cited the Greek and Roman republics as examples. There were men in America as well as in Europe who continue such a hankering for the leeks and onions of Great Britain that they leave no opportunity unoccupied for their introduction into this country. Adams declared that he was too great a friend to democracy ever to wish they may succeed. The issue is thus clearly defined, and I'll stop quoting there. That's enough. But you get a sort of idea of what is happening within the cities at the time. So there's serious changes in the cities. against the democratic forces, basically. So you have the sort of struggle we're talking about is happening at all levels of society, basically, both at the national level, but also a sort of centralization of power struggle is happening within the cities themselves. I'll just mention really quickly, just to Sam Adams' credit, Boston Incorporation did not come until long after he was dead. So Sam Adams succeeded in his endeavor far beyond the grave. Last thing I wanted to look at in the book, let's see. Yes. Quote, one writer in 1786 declared that Pennsylvania had gotten 20,000 German, Irish, and Scottish servants since the war, and that Massachusetts had gotten about 100. End quote. So there is a imbalance between the people coming into the country from Europe, and they are being centered on particular colonies, which is causing, well, as the book says here, concern. And yes, I think that's everything I wanted to discuss for at least this stream. Oh yeah, actually, there was one more thing. I have a note here on page 125 regarding the concept of Republican democracy. Let's see here. Right. Quote, the spirit of optimism, of belief that America is a refuge for the oppressed of the old world, is a place of democratic equality, all show that the American Revolution, in result, if not in origin, was far more a movement for independence. Planted in it were seeds that promised the fruit of democracy. The breakdown of old political controls and the creation of new governments, however similar in form and substance to the old, carried with it the possibility of the democratization of American society. This democratic potential was a fact that all Americans were aware of, however much they might disagree as to its value. Some had wanted it and hoped to work it out within the bounds of independent states. Others were frightened of it, and even before the war was over, had tried to create some form of dictatorship within the new nation. In time, others were to crave a return to monarchical government from which they had fought to escape shortly before. For such people, it was plain that the chief result of the war for independence had been the creation of democracy, either as threat or as actuality. The American Revolution was something that was happening or might happen within the United States, and they hoped either to prevent it in those states where it had not yet taken place, or to circumvent it in those states where it had. In making an opening speech to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Edmund Randolph told its members that the chief danger facing the country, quote, arises from the democratic parts of our state constitutions, end quote. No member rose to deny this. While outside the hall, General Henry Knox declared that the convention had met to, quote, clip the wings of a mad democracy, end quote. Once the convention had presented its work to the public, James Madison argued that the Constitution was better than the Articles of Confederation because a republic was a better form of government than a democracy. Since that day, some writers have ignored the issue or denied that democracy was involved in the disputes of the Founding Fathers. A few have faced the fact that the Founding Fathers, who wrote the Constitution of 1787, were a quite different set of men from those who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. That of the few signers of the Declaration who were in the Convention of 1787, Elbridge Gerry refused to sign the Constitution in its final form, and Robert Morris and James Wilson had been bitter opponents of separation of Great Britain. Only crabbed Roger Sherman of Connecticut willingly agreed to and signed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution of 1787. End quote. So I wanted to get that in simply because this is something that comes up to this day, this idea of whether or not we're a republic and a democracy, and people will say now, as a sort of gotcha, aha, we are a republic and not a democracy. But in fact, we were once a democracy, and whether or not we should be a republic or a democracy was a matter of great contention. And the democracy was more or less, you might say, cooed by a Republican form of government, by as it says here, effectively a completely different set of men than who signed the Declaration and who signed the Articles. The people who signed the Declaration, Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution were very much different people. So to speak of the founding fathers and to sort of reference only the founding fathers in terms of the Constitution plus like George Washington or something is not really accurate. It's sort of intentionally ignoring an entirely separate group of men at that time, the actual Federalists, and not the later Federalists under the Constitution.
Right. This point by Jensen really just kills the meme theory that every American is taught, where your history teacher will say "we," which is this vague, like sneaky pronoun that they always use to smuggle in whatever vagary they need to get their point across. They'll say, "Well, whenever we gained independence, we made a government under the Articles of Confederation and decided that that didn't work. So then we made the Constitution, which worked much better." This is a I really like this point by Jensen here, just because it completely destroys that idea. If there are two completely different groups of people, it shows that there was a political fight that was happening between them, and the side that won out in the end, that we've been left with, and that we've inherited. The side that won out was the constitutionalist or the Republican or the nationalist side of things, at least for the vast majority. I think that even amongst our spheres, this gets lost. I think a lot of people have inculcated or accepted, imbibed this idea that the founders were this one homogenous class of people, that they had this one trajectory, they all had the same flaws, virtues, and whatever else. So I think that's a good point. That's probably on a slightly more shallow level than what we're supposed to be talking about here, but it is always good to point out faults in like the standard history education that Americans receive. That this is this meme that we had the Articles and then we fixed it with the Constitution is flawed just because they were two groups of people. A good thing to understand.
Yes, and with that, we'll go ahead and close out. Jensen just continues with an explanation of this debate and how the revolution, in the most profound sense, was the removal of a centralized power, the British government. And the revolution was not primarily the Constitution or any other form of national government. It was primarily a creation of independent states and not of an national government to replace that centralized government of Great Britain, although that is what ended up happening.
Well,
so
and
that actually yeah.
So I was just going to say, and it's important to realize that for the currently pro-constitutionalist side, as well as the people at the time, they were very grateful, as should you be, that the Articles of Confederation existed, because the worries when the Articles of Confederation were created and the Confederation was established, the worries that they had about tyrannizing power, religious, demographic overbearance, such that minority parts of the countries, in terms of religion and region, could be overvoted. If there was no Articles of Confederation, there would have been no Constitution. And this is actually a point that Woodrow Wilson, in particular, likes to make, being from a different school of history. Wilson being sort of pro-Constitution in an abstract sense, or at least in the original sense as well. It points out that the Articles of Confederation, if you do like the Constitution, are a necessary stepping stone, which, now that I think about it, is also a wonderful refutation of the Articles didn't work, even from the pro-constitutionalist side. And you just have to think about this from a slightly more basic level. Would these small states in the Mid-Atlantic, Puritan New England, the Anglican South, would they all have decided to cede their state's power to form a constitution that we have now just at the outset? And the answer, as we saw by history and the rejection of the Dickinson draft, was just no. So that's all I have.
Yes, and me as well. Certainly, it would seem that the Articles of Confederation protected the the states against a mere replacement of the British aristocracy with virtually the same exact aristocracy without the tie to the crown, because it could have very much been that the revolution proceeds and then effectively almost nothing changes if the same exact people had remained governing in the same exact positions. So that's very important. Let's get to the super chats. We just have a few. We have one typical one from Alexander Hale, who once again gives us $49.99. Thank you very much for generously donating to American Spirits. He says, a noble mission diving deeply into the American spirit. Oh, yep, that is exactly what we're doing, and I think this is really important because everything we've been doing for the past 12 streams, 12 weeks, really a mere 3 months, it's hard to believe how much we can cover in that time, has delved into deeply neglected topics within our spheres over the last several years, if not decade. Melon for $15. Replay gang, cheers. Well, hope you enjoy the replay, Melon. Thank you for the $15. And then Dawn Browning sends us a like a cat, I guess, or it could be a fox in like a samurai outfit, maybe gripping a trophy, or it could be a raincoat. These super stickers are just bizarre, but it does appear to be some sort of samurai cat hugging a trophy. I'm really not sure why it is a samurai, to be honest, but there we go. Thank you for the 20 Australian dollars, Dawn Browning, another routine contributor to these streams, so we definitely appreciate that. And that's all we have. Next time we'll continue with this book. We only actually got about a third of the way into it, so I guess we will see what the rest of the book reveals to us. We'll definitely be on it again next week. I forget what we're going to do between this book and Beard's book. Do you remember what we had planned to break up things a bit?
I actually do not remember what we were going to break it up with, because
we might have not. We might have picked nothing. But we're gonna, after the New Nation, we're gonna take a pause and do something unknown, and then we're gonna do Charles Beard's book on the Constitution, and after that, we're gonna do the Betrayal of the American Right. Correct?
Yeah. Yes, and
Okay.
that Betrayal of the American Right is going to be a real special stream.
Yes, the Betrayal of the American Right. That's going to be an important one. When do we have that scheduled? Was it?
That is November 3rd, if I remember
Okay.
correctly.
I think that is correct. Let me double check that.
Yeah. Do we want to keep it secret why it's going to be special, or are we?
Yeah,
going
let's do
to,
that for now.
Okay. All right.
It's just we have a special guest. It's a guest you're really going to enjoy. And no, it's not Oren. But yeah, okay.
We'll come up with something next week, and or this week, present it next week, and that will break up the progressives.
Yep. So with that.